In Screwed News, when President Obama hasn't pitched the Trans-Pacific Partnership as the most progressive trade deal in history, he's pitched it as something that's awful good for workers. The awful history of so-called free trade deals notwithstanding. For example, in an editorial for the Washington Post earlier this month, the president wrote of the TPP and its target region that increasing trade in this area of the world would be a boon to American businesses and American workers, and it would give us a leg up on our economic competitors. But is that really the case? Does the TPP really help American workers? Turns out it doesn't, at least not according to the government's own estimates. On Wednesday, the International Trade Commission, an independent federal agency, released an official analysis of the TPP's effects and found that the TPP would lead to an actual decline in manufacturing jobs and would slash U.S. manufacturing output by around $11 billion. Joining me now for more on this are Ben Beachy, Senior Policy Advisor for the Responsible Trade Program at the Sierra Club, and Dan Maurer, a legislative representative at the Communication Workers of America. Ben, Dan, great to have you guys with me today. Thanks so much for joining us. Dan, are these numbers surprising to you? Can you talk about the significance of them, especially since they came out of the ITC? Maybe we should even start by describing exactly what the ITC is.
Sure, absolutely. The ITC is a government agency that puts out reports every time there's a trade deal that estimate what are the projected economic impacts. It turns out actually that over time their estimates are almost always over-optimistic. We can get into why as well if you'd like. But when they do that, they look at the tariff cuts from both sides and the efficiencies gained. And it turns out that when, as you said, when you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's going to be a bad deal. In addition to losing $11 billion in manufacturing output, it'll increase the trade deficit by $21.7 billion. And so when you just start from those two facts alone, that we're going to hammer the manufacturing sector, cost good American manufacturing jobs, and then our trade deficit is going to increase, costing us more jobs, that right there alone should tell you that this is not a deal we should support, even if the ITC's results were true, when they're much more likely to be over-optimistic. Yeah,
that's remarkable. Ben, from the Sierra Club's point of view, what are your specific objections to this?
Well, yeah, like as Dan mentioned, the ITC has historically projected benefits from trade deals that have actually failed to materialize. Even if you set aside that track record of failed predictions, and you accept some assumptions that were honestly not very realistic, you're left with their end number, their end conclusion, which is that the sum total of the TPP's economic so-called benefit for the United States would be a number so tiny that it amounts to effectively a rounding error. In exchange for that imperceptible blip to our gross domestic product, we would be signing up for a trade deal that would increase our climate pollution, that would offshore more U.S. jobs, that would further deteriorate U.S. manufacturing, and that would empower corporations, including some of the world's largest polluters, to sue our government in private tribunals over policies that we all rely on for healthy communities and clean air and water.
Yeah. For example, one of the things that I'm just astonished every American doesn't know and isn't in the media constantly is that TransCanada, the Canadian corporation that wanted to build the Keystone XL pipeline, is right now, as we speak, suing us, you and me, the taxpayers, suing our government for $15 billion for lost profits. That they would have made if they'd been able to do the pipeline. And this would open us up to lawsuits from companies in all those other countries as well. Do I have that right?
That's correct. And so, like, for anyone who was not aware of this private tribunal system before, TransCanada has made the threat very clear. They're using NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, as you said, suing us for $15 billion. That amounts to $100 from every individual U.S. tax return for those who filed taxes recently. And they're suing over the rejection of the Keystone XL pipeline, which was a move to protect our climate, protect our water and air from fossil fuels. The thing is that the TPP and this other EU-US trade deal, it's also under negotiation, would empower many more corporations, including many fossil fuel firms, to follow TransCanada's lead and sue the United States government, not in domestic courts, but in these tribunals that are not accountable to any domestic legal system, presided over not by judges, but by corporate lawyers. And they would. This is happening.
And they're not appealable.
They're binding. They're not appealable. They're not bound by legal precedent. We've seen these suits brought against not just our rejection of a pipeline, but a fracking moratorium in Quebec, phase out of nuclear power in Germany, etc. The thing is, we just released a report actually called Climate Roadblocks. You can Google it, just Sierra Club Climate Roadblocks, and it shows that this threat that the TPP would pose to our climate policies via this private tribunal system is really actually unprecedented in the history of U.S. trade deals. Because of the sheer number of fossil fuel firms that would be empowered, it's more than 1,000 fossil fuel firms would get these new broad rights that challenge us in private tribunals if you look at the TPP and the EU-US trade deal. These are some of the world's largest polluters, like BP and Shell in the EU, and in Australia with the TPP, like BHP Billiton, one of the world's largest mining corporations and one of the largest frackers in the United States. And these large polluters have fossil fuel investments across the United States. They're fracking in a dozen states. They're drilling for oil off our shores to the tune of millions of acres. So no prior U.S. trade deal has granted such broad rights to firms with such broad interests in maintaining U.S. fossil fuel dependency, which is why we see this is clearly a raw deal for our climate, for workers, and for our communities.
Dan, you mentioned that the ITC has always been generous or optimistic, I think is the word you used, in their evaluations of these trade deals. Going back to NAFTA, first of all, was NAFTA the first major? It was the first major trade deal, right?
Yeah, it was the first major trade deal of the.
Correct me if I'm wrong on this history. My understanding is that before the Nixon administration, things that we call today trade deals were called treaties. The Constitution calls them treaties. They had to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. Nixon wanted to get around the Senate, so he came up with this idea of these trade agreements. And I think he executed one or two small ones, I'm not sure. And it really didn't go anywhere until NAFTA, and then NAFTA was the big one. Have any of these, and fact check that please, but have any of these trade deals worked to our benefit?
Yeah, I mean, so NAFTA really was a huge expansion in the way that we made it easier for U.S. companies to outsource jobs, usually to low-wage countries where they have very few protections for worker rights, very few protections for the environment. So if you can pay somebody less than $1 an hour, and they can't exercise their rights on the job, and you can do all this while polluting your streams and rivers and the air, it's of course you're going to be able to do it cheaper than you could do it in the United States. Right. So that's what NAFTA has really ushered in. When you look at the ITC's report on NAFTA, they said it was going to create jobs. It turned out that it cost us about 700,000 jobs. If you look at just even more recently, we passed a few years ago a trade agreement with Korea, in which the TPP is actually based on that. And that agreement was supposed to create jobs, according to the ITC, but it cost us 70,000 jobs. And the reason why is actually because their model is broken. And let me give you a couple examples. When countries manipulate their currency, they push the value of their currency down. That makes their goods cheaper, our goods more expensive. That's going to hurt U.S. jobs, obviously, but the ITC doesn't even consider that. Similarly, the TPP, like NAFTA and other previous trade agreements, opens up much of our government procurement market, so some of our Buy American programs will be weakened. So rather than the government buying goods made in the U.S., we'll be buying goods made in a low-wage country like Vietnam. That's going to cost us jobs too. So when you look at those things, it's no surprise that that those things are ignored by the ITC. It's no surprise they're always over-optimistic, right? Yeah. Those things are going to cost us jobs, and if you look at the loss of $11 million in the manufacturing output already under their assumptions, it's just scary to think of what it could be.
This is confounding, Dan. Back in the 90s, I mean, this wasn't like 6 months ago, and we've had plenty of time to learn from this. Back in the 90s, we passed NAFTA, and the ITC didn't calculate it right. Why are they still using stupid calculations that come out with wrong estimates? Is there some kind of regulatory capture here going on, or people working there are looking forward to a job at who knows where?
I think it may not actually be quite so nefarious in this instance. I think they are, the ITC, whenever you go there, and I've testified there before, and others have as well, the ITC always has a generally pro-free trade agreement agenda. And so if they come up with bad estimates on what the output will be, that'll make it harder to sell these agreements. But the other thing I would say is it's really not so much about the ITC, it's about who's behind these trade agreements in general. Because why are we pushing trade agreements that cost American jobs and lower wages in general? And I think the reason why is because corporate interests had very close access to the deal as it was being negotiated. The public had none. Other consumer groups, labor groups had very little. So it's no surprise that an agreement negotiated by Michael Froman, the U.S. ambassador who's the trade representative, who had a long job, worked for a long time at Citigroup, got a $3 million bonus when he went to work in the government, negotiates an agreement that works for companies like Citigroup, and it doesn't work for people like the members that CWA represents.
Remarkable. Ben, both the Sanders candidacy and the Trump candidacy have explicitly repudiated trade deals going all the way back to NAFTA. I mean, in all probability, Donald Trump will change his tune on this now that he's officially a Republican. And Hillary Clinton has come out and said she's opposed to the TPP after speaking in favor of it for 45 different times. So we'll see where she ends up with that. But don't these candidacies and how people have attached themselves, particularly to that part of them, indicate that the whole zeitgeist around this, the whole way of thinking about this in the United States is changing?
Well, it's long been very unpopular to be for these so-called free trade policies that pit workers in the United States against poorly paid workers elsewhere, that increase our climate pollution, that give new rights to foreign corporations to sue our government in private tribunals. That's been unpopular actually for quite a long time, but you're right that the level of unpopularity expressed now is to such an extent that I don't believe one could win the presidency of the United States while being for the TPP. I think the clearest demonstration of that is that not only the three remaining candidates, but many of the candidates in this field throughout this year have said they're against the TPP because it simply is. Support for the TPP is relegated at this point to a relatively fringe elite opinion, whereas most people who have seen the real day-to-day impacts of these trade deals on their jobs, on their wages, on our environment, on our communities, I have said no, we need a new trade model, one that supports our communities, one that supports our climates, one that supports our workers. One thing I would note that came out of the report yesterday is that not only would there be an offshoring of manufacturing, a shift of manufacturing to countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, but that would not only cost U.S. jobs, but also increase our climate emissions. And why? Because the greenhouse gas emissions are much higher from production in those countries. So the ITC report yet again yesterday confirmed what people have seen throughout the last decade.
Got to wrap it up. Ben, Dan, thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today.
Thank you.
Earlier today, President Obama
Senate Republicans previously stated that the component responsible for poisoning people in Flint.
There is always hope.
That's what goes on with our politicians. What are women supposed to do? Here's something else we know.
Between the U.S.
Lawyers
and
at
Cuba.
the ACLU have already some degree of loss in business.
It's a huge difference.
Following the announcement, oil prices.
Nobody's talking about this story because it's garbage.
Real, genuine, and significant change.